You ever been in a place where you feel stuck, like you're waiting for God to show up, but all you hear is silence? Like you're praying, believing, showing up, but nothing seems to change? Let me tell you something, with God, there's always a mean. There are moments in life when we look around and see nothing changing. We pray, but the situation stays the same. We fast, but the breakthrough doesn't come. We believe, but instead of open doors, we face obstacles. And in those moments, it's easy to wonder, God, where are you? But just because we don't see God working doesn't mean He isn't moving. Just because we can't feel progress doesn't mean heaven is silent. God is always working behind the scenes. Think about Esther, a Jewish girl in a foreign land, taken into a palace she never asked to be in. She wasn't in a pulpit. She wasn't leading an army. She was just waiting. It seemed like she was just another girl in a royal court. But in the Bible, we are said, before you were formed, I knew you. While Esther was navigating uncertainty, God was positioning her to save an entire nation. What looked like coincidence was divine orchestration. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of leadership, a promise from God Himself. But instead of stepping into his destiny, he found himself in a pit, then in slavery, then in prison. If Joseph had judged God's faithfulness based on his circumstances, he would have given up in the pit. But in the Bible, we are said, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Even in a prison cell, God was setting the stage for the palace. Sometimes God is answering prayers in ways we don't recognize. While we're asking for doors to open, He's building the foundation so that when the doors open, we'll be ready to walk through them. We see the delay, He sees the development. We see obstacles, He sees opportunity. We see rejection, He sees redirection. Think about Jesus. When He was arrested, beaten, and nailed to the cross, His disciples thought it was over. The Messiah, their hope, was dead. But in the Bible, we are said, my Father is always at work. While the world saw the cross as the end, heaven saw it as the beginning. While they saw a tomb, God saw a resurrection. Behind the scenes, in the silence, salvation was being secured. What if the silence you're experiencing is not a sign of God's absence, but a sign of His presence? What if the situation that seems stagnant is actually a setup? What if the prayers that feel unanswered are actually unfolding behind the scenes? God never stops working. The same God who raised the dead, parted the sea, and turned water into wine is the same God who is working in your life right now. You may not see it yet, you may not understand it yet, but behind the scenes, in ways you cannot see, God is moving. Waiting can feel like wasted time. When you're in the middle of a season where nothing seems to be changing, it's easy to believe that God has forgotten about you. It's frustrating when you've prayed, fasted, and believed, but the situation remains the same. You start asking, why is this taking so long? Or did I miss something? But just because it feels like nothing is happening doesn't mean God isn't working. The meanwhile is not wasted time. It's preparation time. In the Bible, we are said, He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. That means if God started something in your life, He's going to finish it. The waiting season isn't a wasted season. It's the place where God does His deepest work. Look at David. He was anointed as king when he was still a shepherd boy, but he didn't take the throne the next day. Instead, he spent years tending sheep, fighting battles, and even running for his life. It would have been easy for him to wonder, God, didn't you choose me? Why am I still in this field? But what looked like a delay was actually development. Before David could lead a kingdom, he had to learn how to lead in the pasture. In the Bible, we are said, those who are faithful with little will be entrusted with much. The waiting was not wasted. It was preparing him for the weight of his calling. Think about the Israelites. God promised them the promised land, but they didn't walk into it overnight. Instead, they spent 40 years in the wilderness, not because God had forgotten them, but because he was preparing them. The wilderness was where they learned to trust him for daily provision. It was where they saw his miracles. It was where they learned obedience. What looked like wasted time was actually a training ground. And then there's Jesus. Before his public ministry began, he spent 30 years in obscurity. No stage, no miracles, no crowds, just waiting. But in the Bible, we are said there is a time for everything. The years that seemed uneventful were not wasted. They were shaping him for what was to come. God doesn't rush the process. When he allows a season of waiting, it's not because he's ignoring you, it's because he's preparing you. Maybe what you're praying for is ready for you, but you're not ready for it. Maybe he's stretching your faith, refining your character, or positioning things in ways you can't yet see. It might feel like you're stuck, but you are standing in the middle of God's process. The breakthrough isn't just in the answer, it's in the waiting, because in the meanwhile, God is working, shaping, and setting the stage for something greater than you can imagine. Faith is easy when everything is going according to plan, when doors are opening, when prayers are being answered, when life feels like it's moving forward. Believing in God's plan feels natural, but faith isn't really tested when things are going well. It's tested in the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the silence. Faith isn't just about trusting God when you can see him working. It's about trusting him when you can't. There are moments in life when you pray and heaven seems quiet. You take a step forward only to feel like you've been pushed 2 steps back. You believe for breakthrough, but the situation doesn't change. That's when doubt creeps in, whispering, did God forget about me? Maybe I didn't hear him right. What if nothing is actually happening? But in the Bible, we are said we live by faith, not by sight. That means our trust in God isn't based on what we see, it's based on who he is. Look at Noah. God told him to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. People mocked him, and for years, it must have felt like he was building something pointless. Every hammer strike was an act of faith. Every day that passed without a drop of rain was another chance for doubt to creep in. But Noah kept building. He didn't see the storm coming, but he trusted the God who did. In the Bible, we are said by faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, built an ark to save his family. He couldn't see it, but he trusted that God was working. Look at Abraham. God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars, but for years he and Sarah remained childless. There were no signs of change, no proof that what God said would come true. Everything in the natural world told him it was impossible. But in the Bible, we are said, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. He didn't let what he saw determine what he believed. He held on to the promise, even when it seemed impossible. About the disciples. After Jesus was crucified, they were devastated. They had given up everything to follow him, and now he was gone. Saturday must have felt like the longest day of their lives, stuck in the unknown, wondering if everything they believed had been for nothing. But in the silence of that day, something was happening. In the Bible, we are said, for we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Even when they couldn't see it, heaven was moving. Faith is trusting that even when we don't see progress, God is still at work. It's believing that even in the waiting, even in the silence, even in the darkest moments, something is happening. Just because it's unseen doesn't mean it's unreal. Just because we can't feel it doesn't mean he isn't faithful. Timing is one of the hardest things to trust God with. When we pray for something, we expect an answer right away. When we have a dream, we want it to happen immediately. When we're in pain, we want relief as soon as possible. But God's timing doesn't work like ours. He sees the whole picture. He knows the end from the beginning. And what seems like a delay to us is actually his perfect plan unfolding exactly when it needs to. It's frustrating when you feel like you're ready for something, but God hasn't opened the door yet. You look around and see other people getting their breakthrough, stepping into their blessings. And you wonder, God, did you forget about me? But in the Bible, we are said there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. That means every moment of waiting has a purpose. Every season of silence is part of something bigger. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't. Look at Joseph. God gave him a dream of leadership, but for years, his life looked nothing like that promise. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If anyone had a reason to believe that God had forgotten him, it was Joseph. But in the Bible, we are said, at the right time, the Lord will make it happen. When the time was right, Pharaoh had a dream that only Joseph could interpret. And in a single day, he went from the prison to the palace. The waiting wasn't wasted, it was necessary. Think about Moses. He knew God had called him to deliver Israel. But when he tried to step into that calling too soon, he ended up running for his life. He spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep before God finally called him back. That wasn't an accident. God was preparing him, shaping him, teaching him the kind of leadership that couldn't be learned in Pharaoh's palace. In the Bible, we are said, do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. The delay was not denial, it was development. Look at Jesus. When Mary and Martha sent word that their brother Lazarus was dying, they expected Jesus to come immediately, but he didn't. He waited. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. It looked like it was too late, but in the Bible we are said, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. What seemed like a delay was actually setting the stage for a greater miracle. God's timing is never off. When he makes you wait, it's because he's working something out that you can't see yet. It may not happen when you want it to, but when it does, it will be exactly when you need it to. What feels like a delay is often divine preparation for something greater than you imagine. Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan. You step out in faith, and instead of a breakthrough, you run into a setback. You pray for an open door, and instead it slams shut in your face. You do everything right, but things still go wrong. In those moments, it's easy to wonder if you missed God, if you're being punished, or if things will ever turn around. But what looks like a setback is often a setup for something greater. God is never caught off guard. He's not surprised by the detours, disappointments, or delays. What seems like an interruption in your story is actually an important part of it. In the Bible, we are said, what the enemy meant for evil, God used for good. That means the very thing that was meant to break you is what God will use to bless you. The trial that was supposed to take you out is what God will use to take you higher. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, but before he ever saw the palace, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and falsely imprisoned. Every step looked like a setback, but it was actually a setup. If his brothers had never betrayed him, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. If he hadn't been a slave in Potiphar's house, he wouldn't have learned leadership. If he hadn't been in prison, he wouldn't have met the cupbearer who introduced him to Pharaoh. Every painful moment was positioning him for the promise. In the Bible, we are said, all things work together for the good of those who love him. Not some things, not just the good things, all things. Look at Moses. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace, but after killing an Egyptian, he fled into the wilderness where he spent 40 years tending sheep. To most people, that would look like failure. A man who once had influence, now just watching over sheep. But that season wasn't wasted. It was training. When the time came for him to lead Israel out of Egypt, he already knew how to navigate the wilderness because he had spent years there. The very place of his setback became the place of his preparation. Think about Jesus. The cross looked like the ultimate defeat. The enemy thought he had won. The disciples thought it was over. But in the Bible, we are said if they had understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. What looked like a setback was actually the greatest setup in history. What seemed like the end was actually the beginning of salvation for the world. Whatever feels like a setback in your life right now, God is already using it for your good. The closed doors, the disappointments, the hardships, none of it is wasted. The enemy may have tried to stop you, but God is turning it around. What looked like a failure is about to become the foundation for something greater. There are moments in life when everything seems to come to a halt. The dream you once had feels distant, the prayers you've prayed seem unanswered, and the breakthrough you expected hasn't come. It's easy to look at your current situation and assume that this is where the story ends. The enemy wants you to believe that nothing will change, that this is all there is, that you've gone as far as you're going to go. But in the Bible we are said, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. If God started something in your life, he is not about to leave it unfinished. What looks like the end is often just the beginning of something greater. Think about Job. He lost everything, his wealth, his family, his health. If there was ever a person who had a reason to believe his story was over, it was Job. But even in the ashes of his suffering, God was writing a greater story. In Bible, we are said, though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. Job's story didn't end in disaster. It ended in restoration. Everything he lost was returned to him and then some. His suffering was real, but so was his comeback. Look at Peter. He was bold, passionate, and full of faith. Yet in the moment when it mattered most, he denied Jesus 3 times. That failure could have defined him. It could have been the moment where he gave up and walked away, believing he had ruined his purpose. But in the Bible, we are said the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Jesus didn't see Peter as a failure. He saw him as the rock upon which the church would be built. What looked like the end of Peter's story was actually the setup for his greatest days. Consider the Israelites. They had been delivered from Egypt, witnessed the miracles of God, yet found themselves standing at the edge of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in. It seemed hopeless, like their journey was over before it really began. But in Bible, we are said, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. When they thought there was no way forward, God made a way. The sea parted, and what seemed like an impossible situation became a testimony of his power. Maybe right now it feels like your story is over. The disappointment is too deep, the loss too great, the failure too heavy. But God is not finished with you. The very thing that looks like it's meant to break you is what God is going to use to bless you. The waiting, the setbacks, the closed doors, they are not signs of the end. In Bible, we are said, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no human mind has conceived the things God has prepared for those who love him. Your story is still being written, and the best chapters are yet to come. No matter what you're facing, no matter how hopeless it seems, with God, the story is never over. What looks like an ending is often just a transition into something greater. The silence is not absence, the delay is not denial, and the setback is not the final word. God is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating things for your good. In Bible, we are said, he makes all things beautiful in its time. The waiting, the struggles, the disappointments, they all serve a purpose in his divine plan. If you're in a season that feels like a pause, trust that God is writing a greater story than you can see right now. What he started in your life, he will finish. The best is yet to come. Keep believing, keep trusting, and know that with God, there's always a meanwhile, a divine process that leads to his perfect promise.